Hello everyone. Enjoy this relaxing moment as you watch. Juliet's life had always been filled with comfort and luxury, a reflection of the deep affection and care that her parents lavished upon her. Her father, a successful businessman, and her mother, a former lawyer turned philanthropist, had worked tirelessly to build an empire. To Juliet, their home had been more than a house. It had been a sanctuary. The walls of their grand mansion had always been filled with laughter, the hum of lively conversation, and the gentle clink of silverware during family dinners. Every holiday season was an occasion for celebration, and every birthday was met with love and joy. Juliet had always known that she was loved, protected, cherished, and her life was a promise that it would remain so. But everything changed one fateful night when her parents were involved in a horrific car crash. It was raining heavily, and the roads were slick when the accident occurred. Juliet had been asleep in her room, unaware of the tragedy that would soon tear her world apart. The next morning, the world seemed to stand still. Her aunt, whom Juliet had always found to be cold but civil, arrived at their home, her eyes red-rimmed with tears. It was then that Juliet learned that both of her parents had perished in the crash. The words felt foreign in her ears, as though they were meant for someone else, but the pain, the raw, consuming grief, was undeniably real. Her whole existence felt like it had crumbled in an instant, and for a long time, Juliet could not even bring herself to understand how to breathe in a world without her parents. The funeral, an event filled with mourners and well-wishers, was a blur. Juliet was numb, her mind unable to process the outpouring of condolences. But through the haze of sadness, there was one clear and unmistakable fact. She was alone. She was now the sole heir to her parents' fortune, but despite the wealth and assets, Juliet knew nothing could ever replace the loss of her parents. The next weeks were a blur of paperwork, legal meetings, and distant relatives offering their sympathy. Juliet's aunt and uncle, her father's brother and his wife, soon arrived to take custody of Juliet, as her parents had made arrangements for Juliet to be cared for by her family in the event of their death. It was the natural course of things, and for Juliet, it seemed like an arrangement that would bring some semblance of normalcy back into her life. Little did she know, the very family she trusted to take her in would become her greatest tormentors. Her uncle, though he appeared to be a man of wealth and influence, was a stranger to Juliet. He had not been particularly close to her parents, and while he offered the occasional greeting at family gatherings, his presence was always overshadowed by his business affairs. His wife, an even colder figure, had never made an effort to be kind to Juliet. Juliet's memories of her aunt were limited to brief encounters, none of which had left her feeling particularly welcome. But now, her aunt's icy demeanor seemed all the more glaring. The house that Juliet would come to live in was vastly different from her own. It was larger, more imposing, but it felt empty, cold, sterile, and devoid of the warmth that Juliet had once known. The mansion, surrounded by sprawling grounds, seemed like a gilded prison. Juliet's room, though large and tastefully furnished, felt more like a cell. She was alone. Her uncle, a businessman absorbed in his work, barely acknowledged her existence except for brief, impersonal greetings. His wife, on the other hand, was another matter entirely. Juliet's aunt seemed to take pleasure in reminding her of her place, in making it abundantly clear that she was nothing more than a servant in their household. It began subtly. Juliet was told that she would be expected to take care of the household chores, cleaning the rooms, cooking meals, and attending to the garden. At first, she thought this was just temporary, that she would be allowed to continue her education as soon as things settled. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, it became clear that her life had taken a drastic turn. Her uncle's wife, whose coldness had initially seemed like a mere character flaw, was soon revealed to be cruel in ways that Juliet had never imagined. Her aunt made sure that Juliet's days were filled with menial tasks, endless cleaning, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, and tending to the garden. She wasn't allowed to socialize with anyone outside the house, not even her friends from her old life. Her aunt insisted that Juliet's role was to serve the family, and any notion of her pursuing an education or leading a normal teenage life was quickly crushed. Juliet was not permitted to attend school or take part in any extracurricular activities. Every time Juliet attempted to protest or even question why she was being treated this way, her aunt would coldly remind her that she had no right to an opinion. "You're a maid now, Juliet. This is what you're here for." The emotional toll this took on Juliet was almost unbearable. She had been a bright, ambitious young woman with a promising future. Now, she was nothing more than a shadow, her mind dulled by the constant work and isolation. There were moments when Juliet would find herself staring out the window, longing for a world that seemed so far out of reach, her former life, the life of freedom, of laughter, of possibilities. But those moments were fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the reality of her existence. There was no escape. She had no friends here. She had no one to talk to. Her heart ached for the familiar faces, the comforting embrace of her parents, but they were gone, never to return. As time passed, Juliet's aunt's cruelty grew more pronounced. The physical abuse began slowly at first, a slap to the back of the head for a perceived mistake, a harsh shove when Juliet was slow to respond to her demands. But it soon escalated. Juliet was slapped across the face more than once, and there were days when her aunt would berate her for hours, criticizing her appearance, her mannerisms, her every move. "You're just a poor, helpless orphan," her aunt would sneer. "No one cares about you. You're just here to work. Don't think for a second you matter." Her uncle, meanwhile, remained mostly silent. Though he was aware of the abuse Juliet was enduring, he rarely intervened. He seemed content to let his wife handle things, to let her carry on with her treatment of Juliet without question. After all, in his eyes, Juliet was no longer his responsibility. She was just an inconvenience, a reminder of a life he never truly wanted. The days turned into months, and the months into years. Juliet had been living with her aunt and uncle for nearly 4 years by the time she turned 18. She had grown into a young woman, but she was a shadow of the vibrant girl she once was. The physical toll of the hard work was evident. Her skin had become pale, her body thin from exhaustion, her once bright eyes now dulled by the years of neglect and abuse. But despite everything, there was a spark in Juliet that refused to be extinguished. Somewhere deep within her, a flicker of resistance remained. She knew that she couldn't live like this forever. She had to find a way out. And she would. Time had a way of erasing everything. Memories that once seemed vivid and sharp began to blur into a haze, as though they never truly existed. Juliet's life had become a constant cycle of endless tasks, dreary days, and the constant presence of her aunt's cold, unforgiving gaze. Her days blended into one another, a monotonous routine that left no space for joy, no room for hope. Every moment felt like a struggle against an invisible force that held her captive, keeping her from the world she once knew. Her uncle's mansion had become both a physical and psychological prison. Though it was filled with grandiose rooms, gleaming floors, and expensive furnishings, Juliet felt more like a servant than ever before. The mansion's vastness only accentuated her loneliness. The halls that had once echoed with laughter now echoed only with the sound of her footsteps as she worked tirelessly, her body aching from the constant chores and responsibilities that her aunt assigned to her. Her uncle, always absorbed in his work, barely noticed her existence, and when he did, it was always with indifference. It was her aunt, however, who made sure to remind Juliet every day of her place in the house. There were days when Juliet wished she could escape, leave everything behind and run into the unknown. The thought of stepping outside the gates of the mansion, of feeling the warm sun on her skin and the breeze in her hair, filled her with a longing so fierce that it often brought tears to her eyes. But those days were few and far between. The overwhelming weight of her aunt's control, the cruel words she spoke to her every day, and the constant threat of physical punishment kept Juliet trapped. She could barely remember what it felt like to live freely, to be a young woman with dreams and aspirations. Her aunt was the embodiment of cruelty, and her treatment of Juliet only worsened with time. The verbal abuse, which had started as insults, had escalated into outright cruelty. Every moment Juliet spent in the house was a reminder of her status, her worthlessness. "You're just a maid," her aunt would sneer. "You'll never amount to anything. No one cares about you. You're here to work and nothing more." It wasn't just the words, it was the way her aunt said them, with such venom, as if Juliet were the dirt beneath her feet, a nuisance that she could barely tolerate. And yet, Juliet's aunt never let her forget that she owed everything to them. "You're lucky to have a roof over your head," her aunt would remind her, her voice dripping with mock kindness. "Without us, you'd have nothing. Don't forget that." Juliet's life had become a series of monotonous chores: cleaning, cooking, gardening, everything that was expected of her, with no room for herself. Her aunt made sure that Juliet was constantly busy, never allowing her a moment to think or rest. Her only break came when she was sent to bed, exhausted from the day's work, only to be awoken early the next morning to begin the cycle anew. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Juliet had no friends. She was not allowed to leave the house, and even if she were, she didn't know anyone outside of it. Her life had become so constricted that it felt as though she were fading away, her existence shrinking into the confines of the mansion, where no one could see her, and no one cared. But through all of this, there was a part of Juliet that refused to give in completely. Though the world around her was dark and oppressive, something inside her still held on to the hope that one day, she would be free. It was a fragile hope, one that she kept hidden deep within herself, tucked away in the corners of her heart where no one could reach it. She couldn't let it die, not entirely. There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was something she could do to escape. But every time the thought crossed her mind, it was met with the harsh reality of her situation. How could she leave? Where would she go? Her aunt and uncle had stripped her of everything: her education, her social life, her sense of self. She was nothing but a ghost in their home. It wasn't just the abuse that wore on her soul, it was the feeling of being completely invisible. Juliet felt like a nonentity in her own life. She had no voice, no agency, no purpose beyond the tasks her aunt assigned to her. She had once been a bright, outgoing young woman, filled with potential and dreams for the future. But now, she was little more than a shell. She had stopped asking for anything, stopped hoping for better days, because it seemed as though they would never come. The future felt like an impossible dream, a distant land she could never reach. And yet, as difficult as it was to admit, Juliet had begun to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had become quieter, more withdrawn, her once vibrant personality dulled by years of mistreatment. But there was something else too, a growing fire of defiance that simmered beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. It had been years since she had dared to stand up for herself, but something had started to shift in her. Maybe it was the slow realization that she couldn't keep living this way, that something had to change. Or maybe it was simply the slow, steady accumulation of anger that she had buried deep inside of her. But whatever it was, it had begun to take root in her heart. One day, as she was scrubbing the floors of the grand living room, Juliet overheard a conversation between her aunt and uncle. She had always been careful not to listen to their private discussions, not wanting to attract their attention. But this time, she couldn't help it. Her aunt's voice, sharp and biting, rose above the soft hum of conversation. "You know, I'm getting tired of this," her aunt was saying. "She's becoming too much of a burden. We're not here to raise someone else's child. She's nothing but trouble and I've had enough." Her uncle's voice was low, disinterested. "She's just a girl, Miriam. What do you expect? She'll grow up. Let her be." "No, I won't tolerate it any longer," her aunt snapped. "I've done enough for her. She doesn't appreciate anything. She doesn't understand what we've sacrificed to keep her here." The words hit Juliet like a slap in the face. She had always known that her aunt didn't care about her, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so callously, brought the truth crashing down on her. She was nothing more than an inconvenience, a burden to be tolerated until she became of age. And when that time came, Juliet knew what would happen. She would be cast aside like a broken toy, discarded and forgotten. But in that moment, something inside Juliet snapped. She felt a surge of rage and frustration, emotions she had long suppressed. How dare they treat her like this? How dare they strip her of everything and expect her to be grateful? The feeling was foreign to her, unfamiliar, but it was powerful. It was the spark of defiance she had been waiting for, the realization that she did not have to endure this any longer. From that day forward, Juliet began to change. She became more determined, more focused on finding a way out. The small flame of resistance that had flickered in her heart began to grow, fueled by the anger and injustice she felt every day. Juliet was no longer content to simply exist in this house. She would not be silenced. She would fight. The days that followed were filled with quiet, subtle acts of rebellion. Juliet stopped accepting her aunt's cruel words with the same passivity she once had. She began to speak up, if only in the smallest of ways. She no longer allowed her aunt to belittle her without at least a protest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, Juliet felt like she had some control over her own life. Her uncle remained as distant as ever, his indifference giving her no comfort. But Juliet had begun to realize something important. She didn't need him. She didn't need anyone's permission to be free. The small steps she took in asserting herself, in demanding respect, were not without consequence. Her aunt grew more hostile, more belligerent, but Juliet knew that this was the beginning of something greater. She had been silenced for so long, but no longer. She would find a way to escape, to claim the life that had been stolen from her. The months that followed Juliet's silent defiance were filled with subtle but significant changes. She became more aware of her surroundings, of the power dynamics that governed her life in the mansion, and of the way her aunt and uncle held control over her with the weight of their wealth and authority. But Juliet, once meek and passive, had begun to develop a quiet strength that she had never known before. Though she knew it was risky to challenge them openly, her inner resolve had deepened. The small acts of resistance, standing up for herself, speaking her truth, no matter how quietly, had made her feel a flicker of power, a glimmer of hope. That small spark had ignited a fierce determination that she would no longer allow herself to be a passive observer in her own life. She had lived in silence for far too long, and now she was beginning to see that the only way out was to stand up and fight. One evening, as the golden hues of the setting sun crept through the curtains of the sitting room, Juliet found herself once again in the company of her aunt. Her uncle, as usual, was absent, holed up in his study, and Juliet was left alone with the woman who had made her life a living nightmare. Her aunt, Miriam, sat across from Juliet, her sharp gaze never leaving her. Juliet had learned to avoid eye contact, to keep her head down and remain silent, but this time, she did not. This time, she held her aunt's gaze, defiant, unwavering. Miriam raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a cruel smile, as if testing Juliet, seeing how far she could push her. "You're becoming bolder, I see," Miriam commented, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is this your way of fighting back, Juliet? Do you really think that you can change anything?" Juliet's heart raced in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. But there was no turning back now. She had been silent for far too long, and if she didn't speak now, she might never get another chance. Her voice came out soft, but firm, no longer the meek, submissive tone that her aunt had become accustomed to. "I'm not your maid," Juliet said, her words clear, deliberate, though she felt the weight of each syllable. "I'm not here to be treated like an animal. I deserve more than this." For a moment, there was a silence between them, a tension that hung heavy in the air. Miriam's eyes narrowed, and the faintest flicker of surprise passed over her face before it was replaced by her usual cold demeanor. Juliet's words had shaken her, but not enough to make her fear Juliet's newfound courage. "You think you deserve more?" Miriam scoffed, her voice cold and mocking. "You owe everything to me. To your uncle. We didn't have to take you in. You could have been put into an orphanage or worse. You're nothing without us, Juliet. Don't you forget that." Juliet clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as the old resentment surged through her. "You didn't take me in out of kindness. You took me in because you wanted control. You wanted to keep me under your thumb so you could use me as your servant. But I won't stand for it anymore." Her aunt's eyes flashed with fury, her lips twisting into a snarl. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Miriam spat. "You don't know how hard we've worked to keep you here. We've given you everything: comfort, shelter, food. And this is how you repay us? With insubordination?" Juliet took a deep breath, her chest swelling with a mixture of anger and defiance. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask for you to take me in. I didn't ask for this life." Her aunt's face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" "I'm not ungrateful," Juliet interrupted, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "I'm not your servant, Miriam. I'm not something to be used and discarded whenever you feel like it. I'm a person. I have a right to my life, my freedom." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Miriam's face was a mask of fury, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Juliet, on the other hand, felt a surge of pride. She had said it. She had spoken her truth, no matter how dangerous it was. And as she looked at her aunt, who was now seething with anger, Juliet realized something profound. She was no longer afraid. Her aunt had always held power over her, but now, Juliet could feel the balance shifting. Miriam was still a cruel and powerful woman, but Juliet had begun to see that her aunt's power was built on fear, fear of being challenged, fear of being exposed for the monster she truly was. And now, Juliet had taken the first step in dismantling that power. The next few days were tense. Miriam's hostility was palpable, and she made sure to find ways to remind Juliet of her place. There were more chores, more tasks, more cutting words aimed at reminding Juliet that she was nothing more than an unpaid servant in their home. But Juliet stood her ground. She didn't allow herself to be broken by the harshness. She didn't shrink away when her aunt's voice rose in anger. In fact, Juliet began to notice something. Her aunt was losing control. She had always been so sure of her dominance, so certain that Juliet would comply without question. But now, Juliet was pushing back, and for the first time in years, Miriam didn't have all the answers. Juliet's internal shift was just the beginning. Though the outward changes were small, more defiant words, more refusal to obey unreasonable commands, the effect they had on Juliet was monumental. For the first time in 4 years, she began to feel like herself again. She began to feel her identity, her sense of self, return. No longer was she just a nameless figure in the background of her aunt's life. Juliet was a person with thoughts, emotions, and, most importantly, a right to live on her own terms. As the days passed, Juliet's resolve only grew stronger. She started making plans, though they were tentative at first. What was the next step? How could she escape? The mansion felt like a fortress, its high walls and locked gates seemingly impenetrable. But Juliet knew that there had to be a way out. She began researching in secret, reading whatever she could find about the law, about rights, and about how to escape from an abusive situation. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and she knew her aunt would fight back. But Juliet had learned one thing in the years of hardship she had endured: she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. There were moments when fear crept in, when she doubted herself, when the idea of facing her aunt and uncle in a legal battle seemed like an impossible task. But then she would remember the conversations she had overheard, the callous way her aunt had spoken of her as nothing more than a burden. The anger would rise in her chest again, and she would know, with absolute certainty, that she could not allow herself to be silenced anymore. She would fight for her freedom, for her dignity, for the life that had been stolen from her. It was in these quiet moments of determination that Juliet realized something profound. The battle she was about to embark on was not just about escaping her aunt's cruelty, it was about reclaiming her life. It was about standing up for herself and finding the strength to take back what had been taken from her. And for the first time in years, Juliet felt a glimmer of hope. The days that followed Juliet's newfound determination were a whirlwind of both fear and resolve. Each day felt like an uphill battle as she carefully calculated her next steps, mindful of every glance, every whispered conversation, every moment when her aunt or uncle might catch her plotting. Though she had taken the first steps toward reclaiming her dignity, the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. Juliet knew that the moment she made any move toward escaping, toward making her plans known, it would spark a fury that would be almost impossible to contain. Her aunt and uncle had made her life unbearable, but they had also crafted a world where their power seemed untouchable. Juliet was, after all, just a young girl, an orphan in their care. Who would believe her if she spoke up? Despite the overwhelming fear, Juliet remained steadfast. Each morning, as she washed the dishes or cleaned the floors, her mind was consumed with thoughts of how she might finally break free from the suffocating grip of her aunt and uncle's control. But she knew that escape wasn't simply about walking out the front door. She needed a plan, an airtight strategy that would ensure her safety, her survival, and most importantly, her chance at freedom. But what did freedom look like for her? Could she truly leave this mansion, this gilded cage, behind and step into a world she had only heard about in whispers? Juliet's resolve strengthened as she spent long nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling of her small, dimly lit room. She thought of the life she had once dreamed of, the dreams that had been slowly crushed under the weight of her circumstances. She had wanted to be a teacher, to study, to travel, to see the world. She had wanted to be someone. And yet, here she was, isolated, invisible, hidden away from the world. But in her heart, something had shifted. She could no longer sit idly by, hoping for a miracle. She would have to be the one to make that miracle happen. She would have to become her own savior. The first thing she needed was evidence, proof that her aunt and uncle's behavior toward her was not only morally reprehensible but legally punishable. She had overheard enough cruel words to know that they saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded. But that was not enough. She needed concrete proof that would stand up in court. Juliet began watching her aunt more carefully, noting her movements, her conversations, the ways in which she manipulated her uncle into allowing the mistreatment to continue. But Juliet was careful. She didn't want to raise suspicion. Every day, as she completed her chores, she quietly observed, taking mental notes and storing away information for the day when she would confront her aunt and uncle with the truth of their cruelty. She began to pay closer attention to the family's financial records, though it was a risky endeavor. Her uncle's business dealings were shrouded in secrecy, and his wealth was the source of much of their control over her. She couldn't simply take documents, that would be too obvious. But she noticed certain patterns: the frequent business calls, the piles of legal papers, the way her aunt hid the family's affairs from prying eyes. Juliet knew that if she could find a way to access these records without them noticing, it could provide the leverage she needed. One evening, as her aunt spent time preparing for one of the many parties she threw in the mansion's grand ballroom, Juliet made her move. She had noticed that Miriam would often leave her private desk drawer unlocked, and Juliet knew that this was her chance. She slipped into the study quietly, careful to avoid the creaky floorboards, and opened the drawer. Her heart raced as she sifted through the papers: financial statements, legal contracts, correspondence between her uncle and various business partners. There it was, buried beneath the piles of documents. A letter outlining an inheritance her aunt had hidden from Juliet. The inheritance, unbeknownst to Juliet, was a sum of money that her parents had set aside for her education and future. The discovery was not only a betrayal but a revelation. Her aunt and uncle had kept this from her, using the funds for their own gain while denying Juliet any chance at a future. Juliet's hands trembled as she read the letter, her mind spinning with the implications of this discovery. Her parents had worked tirelessly to ensure that she would have a better life, a life that was now being stolen from her. The anger that had been building for years finally erupted inside her, burning away any remnants of doubt or fear she had left. This was no longer just about escaping. This was about holding them accountable for everything they had taken from her. Juliet knew that if she could take this document with her, it would be irrefutable proof of her aunt and uncle's cruelty. It was the key to her freedom. With the letter carefully hidden in her pocket, Juliet left the study and made her way back to her room, her mind racing. She knew that this was only the beginning. There were still many obstacles to overcome, and the road to justice would not be easy. But for the first time in years, Juliet felt a surge of hope. She had evidence. She had a plan. The next few days were filled with tension. Juliet kept to herself, her mind consumed by thoughts of what to do next. She had the document, but she couldn't just go to the police. The legal system was complicated, and without the proper support, she knew that her case might fall apart. She needed to find someone who could help her, someone who would believe her, someone who had the power to help her take her aunt and uncle to court. One afternoon, as Juliet was out in the garden, tending to the flowers, she saw a figure approaching from the distance. It was a woman she had seen before, her neighbor, Mrs. Okoro, who lived a few houses down from the mansion. Mrs. Okoro was a kind woman, though she rarely interacted with Juliet. She was aware of Juliet's situation, of course. Everyone in the neighborhood knew of the wealthy family that had taken in the orphan girl and turned her into a servant. But Mrs. Okoro had always kept her distance, too intimidated by her aunt and uncle's status to offer any help. But today was different. As Mrs. Okoro approached, Juliet felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. There was something in the woman's eyes, something that told Juliet that she was not alone. Mrs. Okoro was not part of the upper class, not one of those who looked down on people like Juliet. She was a working-class woman who understood hardship, and it was this understanding that made Juliet feel as though, for the first time in years, she could trust someone. "Juliet," Mrs. Okoro called softly as she reached the garden gate. "How are you, my dear?" Juliet looked up, her heart racing. She hadn't expected to be approached, but something in the woman's voice seemed genuine, kind. For a moment, Juliet hesitated, unsure whether to open up about the depths of her suffering. But the truth was too much to hold inside any longer. She needed help. "I'm not well, Mrs. Okoro," Juliet replied, her voice trembling. "I've been treated terribly by my aunt and uncle. They've kept me here for years, forced me to work without a break, denied me an education, everything. I don't know what to do anymore." Mrs. Okoro's face softened with sympathy, and she reached through the gate, gently taking Juliet's hand in hers. "I've seen how they treat you, child. You don't deserve this. But you must be careful. People in this neighborhood are afraid of your uncle and aunt. They have too much power. But I can help you. I have a friend who works as a lawyer in the city. He might be able to help you get justice." For the first time in years, Juliet allowed herself to hope. She had a plan. She had evidence. And now, she had someone who believed her. The following weeks were a blur of urgency and anxiety as Juliet moved forward with her plan. The letter she had found in her aunt's study was a lifeline, a key that could unlock the door to her freedom. But Juliet knew that simply possessing the document was not enough. She had to take action, and she had to do so carefully. Her every move had to be calculated, every step shrouded in secrecy, for the last thing she wanted was to alert her aunt and uncle to the danger they were facing. If they discovered her intentions, Juliet knew they would stop at nothing to silence her. Mrs. Okoro, her trusted ally, had introduced Juliet to the lawyer, a man named Mr. Chukwuma, who worked in the city. He was a man of integrity, known for his quiet but resolute pursuit of justice for the voiceless, and he agreed to meet Juliet in private to discuss her case. Juliet had only ever heard stories about the legal system, about how difficult it was to get justice, especially for someone like her, an orphan with no wealth or influence. But she had also learned something over the past few months. The law, for all its flaws, could be a weapon if wielded correctly. And Juliet had nothing left to lose. She was determined to fight, not just for herself, but for all the young girls like her, trapped in circumstances beyond their control. One evening, under the cover of nightfall, Juliet made her way to the agreed-upon meeting spot, a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, hoping to blend in with the crowd. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked along the dimly lit street, each step taking her farther from the mansion and deeper into the unknown. The city was a strange and intimidating place, filled with people who had lives that seemed so different from her own. But Juliet had no choice. She had to take this step, no matter how terrifying it seemed. When she arrived at the cafe, she spotted Mr. Chukwuma sitting at a corner table, his back to the wall. He was an older man, with a calm and composed demeanor, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if always alert. Juliet hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect, but then she gathered her courage and walked over to him. "Mr. Chukwuma?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. He looked up, his eyes briefly scanning her before he gave her a small nod. "Juliet, I presume?" he said, his voice deep but kind. "Please, sit down." She took a seat across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the letter on the table. Mr. Chukwuma's eyes flickered to the document, and then back to Juliet's face, his expression unreadable. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice calm but firm. Juliet swallowed hard, her throat dry as she began to recount her story. She told him of the tragic death of her parents, how her uncle and aunt had taken her in under the pretense of care, only to treat her like a servant. She spoke of the long hours of work, the verbal and emotional abuse, the constant neglect, and the denial of her education. She told him about the inheritance her parents had left her, which her aunt and uncle had hidden away, using the funds for their own benefit. She explained how she had managed to obtain the letter and the details of her parents' will. Mr. Chukwuma listened intently, his face a mask of concentration as he absorbed every word. There were no interruptions, no judgments, just a quiet understanding that made Juliet feel as though she was being heard for the first time in years. When she finished, he took the letter in his hands and examined it carefully, his fingers running over the neat script and official seals that confirmed the authenticity of the document. "This is substantial," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Your aunt and uncle have clearly been hiding this from you. And if what you're saying is true, then they've deprived you of what is rightfully yours. This is not just a case of abuse, this is theft. The law can help you, but we will need to move cautiously. The evidence you have is strong, but it will not be easy to take on such powerful people." Juliet nodded, her heart racing. She knew the risks involved. Her aunt and uncle were wealthy and well-connected. They had influence in the community, and their status gave them a kind of immunity that could be hard to break. But Mr. Chukwuma's words gave her hope, a glimmer of belief that she might actually have a chance at reclaiming her life. "We will start by filing a claim for the inheritance," he continued. "If we can prove that they have wrongfully withheld what was left to you, it will give us leverage in the abuse case. We will need to gather more evidence, of course. Witnesses, records, testimonies from people who may have seen how you've been treated. This won't be a fast process, but it's possible. You have a right to your inheritance, and you have a right to live free from abuse. Together, we will make sure that your voice is heard." Juliet felt a surge of relief flood through her. For the first time, the weight of her situation didn't feel as crushing. There was a path forward, a way out, and it was within her reach. She wasn't alone anymore. "But you must be careful," Mr. Chukwuma warned, his voice suddenly serious. "If they find out what you're planning, they will retaliate. You need to keep this quiet, especially from your aunt and uncle. I suggest you stay away from them for now, as much as possible. We don't want to give them any reason to suspect that you're taking legal action. And once we begin the proceedings, be prepared for them to fight back with everything they have." Juliet nodded, absorbing the gravity of his words. She knew the risks, but she was ready. She couldn't turn back now. She had lived in fear for far too long. It was time to stand up and take back what was rightfully hers. Over the next few days, Juliet kept her distance from her aunt and uncle, continuing to perform her household duties but avoiding direct contact whenever possible. She knew that the moment her aunt or uncle sensed something was amiss, they would act quickly to shut her down. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Mr. Chukwuma began to prepare the necessary legal documents, filing the claim for the inheritance first. Juliet could feel the pressure building with each passing day. She had to be strong, stronger than she had ever been before. She had to be patient, biding her time while Mr. Chukwuma worked on her behalf. But she also knew that every day she waited, her aunt and uncle were growing more comfortable in their control, more entrenched in their lies. As the weeks turned into months, Juliet's life in the mansion became even more oppressive. Her aunt's cruelty increased in subtle ways. More insults, more demands, more threats. Her uncle, who had always been distant, grew colder and more dismissive. Juliet could feel the walls closing in around her, but she remained steadfast. She knew that this was the final stretch, the point where she could either give up or continue to fight. And Juliet had no intention of giving up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the legal papers were filed. Juliet felt a tremor of fear and excitement as Mr. Chukwuma informed her that the claim had been officially submitted. The wheels of justice were in motion, and there was no turning back. But as the days passed and the legal proceedings began, Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that her aunt and uncle were watching her more closely than ever. Their suspicions had likely been aroused, and she knew that the battle ahead would not be easy. They would fight her with everything they had: money, power, influence. But Juliet had something they didn't: the truth. The fight for her freedom had begun. The weeks following the filing of Juliet's claim were filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The first few days had felt like a momentary reprieve, like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating silence. But now, as the days stretched into weeks, the reality of what she had set into motion began to sink in. The legal proceedings were not a swift process. They were long, drawn out, and filled with uncertainty. Juliet had taken her first step toward justice, but she still had a long road ahead. The mansion, once a symbol of security, had become an even darker place, one where suspicion, fear, and tension hung in the air like a heavy fog. Her aunt and uncle had not yet confronted her directly about her actions, but Juliet could sense that they were aware of something amiss. Their once passive disdain had turned into something more dangerous, an undercurrent of hostility that she could feel in every glance, in every word they spoke. They were watching her more closely now, their eyes sharp with suspicion, as if they were waiting for her to slip up. Juliet knew that they would not let her go without a fight. They had built their entire lives on lies and manipulation, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. She had seen the way they treated people who threatened their power. There was no limit to their cruelty. And yet, despite the fear that gnawed at her every waking moment, Juliet refused to back down. She had made her decision. She was going to see this through, no matter what. As the legal proceedings progressed, Juliet continued her routine, hiding her anxiety behind a mask of stoic determination. She did not let her aunt and uncle see the fear in her eyes, nor did she let them witness the sleepless nights when she lay in bed, the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She had become a master of concealing her emotions, of appearing unaffected when, in reality, she was constantly on edge. Every day, she waited for the inevitable confrontation, the moment when her aunt or uncle would pull her aside and demand answers. And yet, that moment never came. Instead, the tension between them simmered beneath the surface, like a storm waiting to break. It wasn't until one fateful evening that the first real confrontation occurred. Juliet had been in the garden, tending to the flowers, when her aunt appeared in the doorway, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Juliet felt a chill run down her spine as she turned to face her aunt, who was dressed in a sleek, dark-colored gown, her lips painted a bold red. Miriam's expression was a mask of cold indifference, but Juliet could see the fury lurking just beneath the surface. Her aunt's eyes were narrowed, her hands clenched at her sides. Juliet knew instantly that this was not a casual visit. It was a confrontation, one that would set the stage for everything to come. "You've been acting strangely lately, Juliet," Miriam said, her voice smooth but laced with venom. "I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something different about you. You've been distant, aloof. It's almost as if you're hiding something from me." Juliet's heart raced, but she remained composed. She kept her face blank, her hands steady as she continued working with the flowers. "I'm just busy with my chores, Aunt Miriam," she replied evenly, trying to deflect the tension in the air. "There's nothing to worry about." Miriam's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, only cold calculation. "Oh, I'm not worried, Juliet," she said. "But I know you've been meeting with people. Strange people. People who could make things difficult for us. You haven't been as careful as you think." Juliet felt her breath catch in her throat. Her aunt knew. Somehow, Miriam had discovered that she had been in contact with Mr. Chukwuma, the lawyer. Juliet's mind raced, but she fought to keep her composure, to mask her fear behind the calm facade she had perfected. She had expected this, had known that, sooner or later, her aunt would find out. But that did not make the moment any less terrifying. "I don't know what you mean," Juliet said, her voice steady despite the knot of fear in her stomach. "I've done nothing wrong." Miriam's eyes bored into her, sharp and unyielding. "Don't lie to me, Juliet. I know exactly what you're up to. You think you can just take what's mine? You think you can claim what you have no right to? I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for." The words cut through Juliet like a knife. Miriam's hatred was palpable, and for the first time, Juliet saw her aunt for who she truly was, a woman who would stop at nothing to keep her wealth and power, even if it meant crushing an innocent girl beneath her heel. "Aunt Miriam, I'm not trying to take anything from you," Juliet said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I'm only trying to get what was left to me. I'm not your servant anymore. I have a right to my own life, to my future." Miriam's face twisted with rage. She stepped forward, her hand rising as if to strike, but Juliet stood her ground. She would not be cowed by fear anymore. She had endured the worst of Miriam's cruelty, and now, in this moment, she realized something. She was stronger than her aunt had ever given her credit for. Her will was unbreakable, her resolve unshakable. Miriam had tried to break her, to keep her in a cage of fear and silence, but Juliet had found her voice. And now, she would not be silenced. "You think you can stand up to me?" Miriam spat, her voice trembling with anger. "You think you can win against me? You're nothing. You're just an orphan, a nobody. You have nothing." Juliet's breath was shallow, but her heart pounded with fierce defiance. "I have everything I need," she said, her voice stronger now. "I have the truth, and that's all I need to make things right. You can't take that away from me." Miriam's eyes narrowed dangerously, and for a moment, Juliet thought she saw something akin to fear flicker in her aunt's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once more by cold, calculated hatred. "You've made a mistake, Juliet," Miriam hissed. "You've made the biggest mistake of your life." And with that, she turned and stalked back into the house, leaving Juliet standing in the garden, her heart racing, her body trembling. The confrontation had left her shaken, but it had also steeled her determination. Miriam's words, though cruel, had only made one thing clear to Juliet. This was a battle she had to win. There was no turning back now. Her aunt and uncle would do everything in their power to stop her, but Juliet had already taken the first steps toward her freedom. She had nothing left to lose, and she was willing to fight for everything she had been denied. The days that followed were filled with mounting tension. Juliet knew that her aunt and uncle would not take her defiance lightly, and she braced herself for the storm that was surely coming. But as the legal case moved forward, Juliet felt a sense of determination take root within her. The process was slow, and the road ahead was filled with obstacles, but each step she took brought her closer to the justice she had longed for. And with Mr. Chukwuma's steady support, Juliet began to see that her fight was not just about reclaiming her inheritance, it was about reclaiming her life. In the courtroom, Juliet would face her aunt and uncle once again, but this time, she would not be the frightened, silenced girl they had once controlled. She would be a young woman, standing tall, her voice strong and clear. And in that moment, Juliet knew, no matter the outcome of the case, she had already won. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.